The fireplace at Grimmauld Place roared green, and Harry stepped back as Hermione emerged in a whirl of emerald flames, clutching her beaded bag and looking only slightly disheveled. She brushed ash from her jumper with practiced efficiency, then turned to him with that particular expression she wore when about to deliver important instructions. "Remember to speak clearly," she said, as though Harry hadn't traveled by Flu Network dozens of times. "And don't forget your trunk this time." Harry grinned, hefting his bag. "That was once, Hermione. Once. Twice, actually. There was that time in 4th year when... Are you two coming or not?" Ron's voice echoed from somewhere beyond the green flames, impatient and warm. "Mum's got the kettle on, and she's threatening to send the ghoul after us if we're late for supper." Hermione stepped aside, gesturing for Harry to go first. He took a handful of Flu powder from the pot on the mantel, the glittering dust cool and silky between his fingers. The familiar tingle of magic ran up his arm as he threw it into the flames. "The Burrow," he called clearly, and stepped into the emerald fire. The spinning, lurching sensation lasted only moments before Harry tumbled out onto the familiar worn rug of the Weasley sitting room. He caught himself before sprawling completely, straightening just as Ron grabbed his elbow. "Graceful as ever, mate," Ron said, but he was smiling. Harry barely had time to move aside before Hermione arrived, managing somehow to step out of the fireplace with perfect posture, her bag still clutched neatly in one hand. Ron shook his head in amazement. "How do you do that?" "Proper foot placement and core balance," Hermione replied primly, but her eyes sparkled. Harry simply needs a proper welcome." Molly Weasley appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from the kitchen's warmth, wiping her hands on her apron. The apron itself was embroidered with dancing pumpkins that actually moved, waddling across the fabric in an endless parade. She pulled Harry into a tight embrace that smelled of cinnamon and something sweet baking in the oven. "Lovely to have you here, dear," she said, holding him at arm's length to look him over with that particular maternal scrutiny she'd perfected over 7 children. "You look thin. Doesn't Creature feed you properly at Grimmauld Place?" "He does, Mrs. Weasley. Honestly." "Molly, dear, how many times must I tell you?" She turned to embrace Hermione just as warmly. "And you, Hermione. Always such a pleasure. Now, both of you must be famished from the journey. Supper's nearly ready, but I've got fresh scones if you'd like something to tide you over." The Burrow wrapped around Harry like a favorite blanket. The sitting room was already adorned for Halloween. Paper bats swooped lazily near the ceiling, their enchantment simple but effective, and dried corn stalks stood in the corners, tied with orange ribbon. Through the window, Harry could see dusk settling over the orchard, the gnarled apple trees silhouetted against a sky going purple and gold. "Where is everyone?" Hermione asked, setting her bag down carefully beside the sofa. "Arthur's still at the ministry. Should be home any moment. Ginny's in the garden trying to catch gnomes. She's got some notion about dressing them up for tomorrow. Bill and Fleur are coming tomorrow afternoon, and Charlie sent his regrets from Romania. Percy." Molly's expression tightened slightly. "Well, Percy sent a very official note about ministry obligations." An uncomfortable silence threatened, but Ron broke it with his usual perfect timing. "And Fred and George?" "In their room," Molly said, her tone shifting to one Harry knew well. the voice of a mother suspecting mischief. "They've been up there all afternoon, and I've heard several suspicious bangs. They swear they're working on shop inventory, but I know those two." As if summoned by the mention of their names, twin thuds sounded from somewhere above, followed by muffled laughter. A moment later, Fred and George thundered down the stairs, identical grins on their faces. "Harry, old chap," Fred exclaimed. "And the lovely Hermione," George added, just in time for the festivities. They spoke in their usual rapid-fire tandem, and Harry felt his grin widening. The twins looked positively delighted with themselves, which usually meant trouble of the most entertaining sort. "What are you two planning?" Hermione asked suspiciously. "Planning?" Fred pressed a hand to his chest in mock offense. "We're hurt, Hermione," George continued, "truly wounded. We're merely preparing to celebrate Halloween in the time-honored tradition of scaring the daylights out of our dear family members. Nothing dangerous," Fred added quickly, catching his mother's warning look. "All tested, all safe. Mostly safe," George amended. "Reasonably safe." "Boys," Molly said warningly. "Perfectly safe, Mum," they chorused together, attempting expressions of angelic innocence that didn't suit them at all. The kitchen timer chimed, and Molly bustled back toward the kitchen, muttering about those two and never a moment's peace. The twins waited until she was out of earshot before leaning in conspiratorially. "Actually, Harry," Fred said in a lower voice, "we could use your help with the final test tomorrow." "Nothing that'll get anyone in trouble," George assured him. "Just some quality control on our new line of Halloween specials. We've got phantom fudge. Makes you temporarily transparent. Ghostly gazes. Your eyes glow in the dark for an hour. And our personal favorite, Specttopheres. Toss one, and it creates a harmless phantom that tells terrible jokes." Harry laughed. "Sounds brilliant. Count me in." "I suppose I should supervise," Hermione sighed, but she was smiling. "Someone needs to ensure you don't violate any reasonable safety standards." "There's our Hermione," Fred said warmly. "Always thinking of safety standards," George agreed. "We've missed having you lot around," Fred added, and for a moment his expression was entirely sincere. "The Burrow's better with a full house." The back door opened, and Ginny came in, her hair windblown and her hands muddy. She was carrying a small sack that wriggled ominously. "Got 3 of them," she announced triumphantly. "The little beasts put up quite a fight, but I think they'll look adorable in the tiny hats I made. Ginny, dear, wash up before supper," Molly called from the kitchen. Ginny rolled her eyes, but set the sack down carefully in the corner. Harry saw tiny, gnarled fingers poking through the weave, and headed toward the stairs. She paused to wave at Harry and Hermione. "Good, you're here. Mum's been watching the flu every 5 minutes for the past hour. Tomorrow's going to be excellent. Dad's been practicing his Muggle stories for weeks." She disappeared upstairs, and Harry exchanged glances with Ron and Hermione. Arthur's Muggle obsession was legendary, and his Halloween stories were bound to be entertainingly bewildering. The flu roared again, and Arthur Weasley stepped through with considerably less grace than Hermione had managed. His robes were slightly singed at the hem, his glasses askew, but his face lit up when he saw their guests. "Harry, Hermione, wonderful, wonderful." He straightened his glasses and brushed ash from his shoulders. "Molly said you'd be arriving today. Excellent timing. I've been doing research on Muggle Halloween traditions, Absolutely fascinating stuff. Did you know they actually encourage their children to approach strangers' homes and demand sweets? And the strangers give them. Remarkable trust in their community structures, really. When you think about Arthur, "Dear, wash up for supper," Molly called, her voice carrying that particular mix of affection and exasperation that seemed unique to long marriages. "Right, yes, of course." Arthur beamed at them once more before heading toward the kitchen, still muttering about trick-or-treating and the sociological implications of costume wearing. Ron led them upstairs to stow their bags. The Burrow stairs creaked with each step, the walls covered in family photographs that waved as they passed. Harry caught a glimpse of one from their second year, Ron and himself, looking significantly younger, grinning at the camera. "You're in with me, Harry," Ron said, pushing open the door to his room. The Chudley Cannons posters had been joined by a few new ones, and his room was its usual comfortable disaster of scattered clothes and Quidditch magazines. "Hermione, you're in Ginny's room." Mum set up the camp bed. They had just finished putting their things away when Molly's voice echoed up the stairs. "Supper." The kitchen table was already groaning with food when they arrived. A proper Molly Weasley feast with roast chicken, mashed potatoes, 3 different vegetables, and fresh rolls that steamed when you broke them open. The pumpkin decorations on her apron had been joined by actual miniature pumpkins, floating lazily around the kitchen ceiling, each one glowing with a soft orange light. "The floating pumpkins are new," Harry said, watching one bob past. "Practice for tomorrow," Molly explained, setting down a gravy boat. "We're going to enchant the whole garden with them. It's become something of a tradition. Been doing it for years. But each Halloween, I try to improve the charm work." "The levitation charm's basic enough," Hermione observed, watching the pumpkin's gentle movement. "But you've added a randomized floating pattern, haven't you? And the light source is internal, not a Lumos charm." "Very good, dear." Molly looked pleased. "It's a combination of 3 charms, actually. The trick is layering them so the magic doesn't interfere. I thought perhaps tomorrow you could all help with the enchanting. Many hands make light work, and it's rather fun." "I'd love to help," Hermione said eagerly. "I've been reading about sustained enchantment in practical household magic, and the theory behind—" "Here we go," Ron muttered good-naturedly, but he was smiling. They settled around the table, squeezing in with the comfortable chaos that was typical of Weasley family meals. Arthur launched into an enthusiastic explanation of Muggle Halloween's safety precautions, something about reflective tape and adult supervision, while Fred and George exchanged meaningful glances that probably indicated planned mischief. Ginny sketched costume designs for her captured gnomes on a spare bit of parchment. Harry helped himself to potatoes and felt something in his chest loosen, some tension he'd been carrying without realizing it. The Burrow was always like this, warm and loud and slightly chaotic, but so full of life and love that it seeped into your bones. The autumn evening darkened beyond the kitchen window, and the floating pumpkins cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Harry, dear, are you all right?" Molly asked suddenly, noticing his quiet. He realized he'd been sitting with his fork halfway to his mouth, just soaking in the atmosphere. "Yeah," he said, and meant it completely. "Just glad to be here." Molly's expression softened. "We're glad to have you, dear. Always." "Both of you," Arthur added, nodding to Hermione. The Burrow's at its best when it's full of young people. Keeps Molly and me from getting too set in our ways. As if you could ever be set in your ways, Dad, Ginny said. You just spent 20 minutes explaining rubber to me yesterday. Rubber is fascinating, Ginny. The process of vulcanization alone. Supper continued with laughter and comfortable conversation, the sort of meandering discussion that jumped from Quidditch to ministry politics to the proper pronunciation of Latin in spellwork. The food was excellent, as Molly's cooking always was, but more than that, it was the feeling of being part of something, part of this family that had welcomed him so completely. After supper, they moved to the sitting room where the fire crackled cheerfully. Molly brought out apple cider that steamed in their mugs, the scent mixing with wood smoke and the lingering sweetness of dessert. A pumpkin tart that had been almost too beautiful to eat. Tomorrow's going to be a full day, Molly said, settling into her favorite chair with her knitting. The needles moved of their own accord, clacking away at what looked like another jumper. We'll start enchanting the pumpkins after breakfast. Arthur's planning his story session for the afternoon. I've prepared extensively, Arthur said proudly. And then the twins have promised not to unleash whatever they're planning until after supper. We promise nothing, Fred said. But we'll probably wait until after supper, George conceded. Bill and Fleur should arrive around 2, Molly continued. It'll be lovely to have everyone together. Well, almost everyone. A shadow crossed her face, there and gone. Hermione tactfully changed the subject. What sort of Halloween traditions do wizarding families have? I mean, I know the history, Samhain, and the thinning of the veil between worlds. But what do people actually do? Depends on the family, Arthur said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm he brought to any educational opportunity. Some of the old families still observe the traditional ceremonies, leaving offerings for ancestors, that sort of thing. More common now is what we do, decorating, special meals, telling stories. It's become a night for families to gather, especially after... He didn't need to finish. After Voldemort, he meant. After the war had taken Halloween from a night of fun and turned it into an anniversary of tragedy. Harry understood what the Weasleys were doing, had been doing for years, reclaiming the holiday, filling it with warmth and laughter instead of darkness and fear. I think your traditions are lovely, Hermione said softly, understanding too. Well, Molly said briskly, setting down her knitting, tomorrow we'll make more lovely traditions. Now, off to bed, all of you. We've got an early start, and I won't have anyone too tired to enjoy themselves properly. They said their good nights and headed upstairs. In Ron's room, Harry lay in the camp bed Molly had set up, listening to the familiar sounds of the burrows settling for the night. The ghoul in the attic banging around, a loose shutter tapping somewhere, Ron's gentle snoring from across the room. Through the window, he could see stars emerging in the clear October sky. Tomorrow would be Halloween, a day that had marked both his greatest joy and deepest sorrow. But here, at the Burrow, surrounded by people who loved him, it was just a holiday, just a celebration of autumn and magic and being together. Harry smiled in the darkness and let the Burrow's warmth carry him towards sleep, the scent of cinnamon still lingering in the air, the promise of floating pumpkins, and Fred and George's mischief waiting for tomorrow. Outside, the first of Molly's enchanted pumpkins bobbed past the window, glowing softly orange against the night, a small magic that felt like coming home. Morning arrived at the Burrow the way it always did, with the smell of frying bacon, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, and Molly's voice carrying up the stairs with cheerful authority. "Breakfast in 10 minutes. Don't make me send the twins up there." Harry blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the slanted ceiling and orange walls before remembering where he was. Across the room, Ron was still buried under his covers, only a tuft of red hair visible. Harry grabbed a pillow and lobbed it across the gap. "Geroff," Ron mumbled, swatting blindly. "Your mum's threatening to send Fred and George." That got Ron moving. They'd all learned years ago that the twins' wake-up methods were creative, effective, and usually involved something that took hours to wash out of your hair. The kitchen was already bustling when they arrived. Molly stood at the stove managing multiple pans at once, eggs scrambling themselves in one, bacon sizzling in another, while toast popped up from a rack that caught each slice and buttered it automatically. Hermione sat at the table with a cup of tea, looking far too alert for this hour, a book propped open beside her plate. "Good morning," she said brightly. "Molly's been explaining the theory behind sustained levitation charms. Did you know the spell has to account for air currents and temperature variations, or the objects start to drift?" "Fascinating," Ron said, reaching for the bacon. "Really riveting before I've had breakfast." Ginny appeared in the doorway, already dressed and looking energetic. "Morning. Dad left early. Some crisis at the ministry about a muggle alarm clock that someone enchanted to scream instead of ring. He'll be back by lunch." "Where are Fred and George?" Harry asked, noting the unusual quiet. "Still asleep, believe it or not," Molly said, cracking eggs with practiced efficiency. "I checked on them earlier. They were both snoring, surrounded by what looked like enough magical merchandise to stock a small shop. I didn't look too closely." "Probably wise," Ginny said, stealing a piece of toast. They ate breakfast in the comfortable morning quiet, the autumn sun streaming through the kitchen windows and catching the dust motes in golden shafts. Outside, the garden still held the morning mist, the pumpkin patch visible beyond the tool shed where a dozen large pumpkins sat waiting. "Right then," Molly said, surveying her clean plates with satisfaction. "Time to get started on the decorating. We'll need to bring the pumpkins up from the patch. Ginny, dear, could you wake your brothers? I want all hands for this." Ginny headed upstairs with a suspicious smile that suggested the twins' wake-up call would be memorable. Sure enough, moments later, there was a yelp, some creative cursing, and the sound of something wet hitting a wall. "They'll be down shortly," Ginny announced, reappearing with a satisfied expression. "What did you do?" Ron asked. "Aguamenti charm set to cold. Very cold." She helped herself to more tea, looking innocent. Fred and George stumbled down minutes later, their hair damp and sticking up at odd angles, both wearing expressions of grudging respect. "Well played, sister," Fred admitted. "We taught you too well." George agreed. "You taught me perfectly," Ginny corrected. "Now come on. Mum wants help with the pumpkins." They trooped out into the garden, the morning air crisp and smelling of damp earth, and the last of the autumn roses climbing the garden fence. The pumpkin patch was Arthur's pride. He'd been experimenting with agricultural charms, and the results were impressive. The pumpkins ranged from small ones, perfect for floating, to massive specimens that would need multiple people to lift. Beautiful crop this year, Molly said, with satisfaction. Arthur's been singing to them. Says he read about it in a Muggle gardening magazine. Does singing actually help? Hermione asked, her curiosity piqued. Hard to say, Molly replied, but they did turn out particularly well, so perhaps there's something to it. Now, we'll need about 20 for floating. Choose ones that are nicely shaped and roughly the same size. The large ones we'll set around the garden as centerpieces. They set to work, Ron and Harry hauling the bigger pumpkins, while Ginny and Hermione selected the floating candidates. The twins, still somewhat damp, levitated several pumpkins at once with theatrical wand movements. Show-offs, Ginny muttered. Years of practice, little sister, Fred said. One must master the basics before attempting true artistry, George added solemnly. Once they had 20 suitable pumpkins arranged on the grass near the house, Molly gathered them in a semicircle. She pulled out her wand, the morning light catching on the polished wood. Right then, the charm work for floating pumpkins is actually 3 spells layered together. Hermione, you had it right last night. It's more complex than a simple levitation charm. Molly pointed her wand at the nearest pumpkin. First, the base levitation, Wingardium Leviosa. The pumpkin rose smoothly into the air, hovering at about head height. That's the easy part, Ron whispered to Harry. We could do that in the first year. The second charm adds the wandering movement, Molly continued. Watch carefully. The wand movement is a gentle figure 8, Vagus Fluito. She traced the pattern in the air, and the pumpkin began to drift lazily, moving in a slow, random pattern that looked natural rather than mechanical. And finally, the illumination charm. This isn't a simple lumos. That would be too bright and too harsh. This is Lux Interna, which creates a warm glow from within. She tapped the pumpkin with her wand. The light needs to be orange gold, so you have to visualize that color as you cast. The pumpkin began to glow, a soft jack-o'-lantern light emanating from inside its flesh. It floated there in the morning sunshine, drifting gently, looking like something out of a storybook. Brilliant, Harry said. Now you all try, Molly instructed. Start with just the levitation, then add the movement once you've got that steady. The illumination can come last. Hermione approached her pumpkin with the methodical precision she brought to all spell work. Her levitation charm was textbook perfect, the pumpkin rising smoothly. The wandering charm took her 2 attempts. The first made the pumpkin move in rigid straight lines, but her second try produced a natural drifting pattern. Excellent, dear, Molly praised. Ginny had her pumpkin floating and wandering within minutes, the years of growing up in a magical household evident in her easy competence. She added the illumination with a flourish, and her pumpkin glowed a perfect warm orange. Ron's levitation was fine, but his wandering charm sent the pumpkin careening wildly to the left, nearly hitting Fred in the head. Oi, watch it. Sorry, Ron said, grabbing his pumpkin and pulling it back down. The wand movement's trickier than it looks. Slow down, Molly advised. The figure 8 needs to be smooth, not rushed. Here. She moved behind him, guiding his wand hand through the motion. Like this, gentle and flowing. Ron tried again, and this time the pumpkin drifted more naturally, if somewhat uncertainly. Harry found the levitation easy enough, but the wandering charm gave him trouble. His pumpkin kept trying to drift upward, as though it wanted to escape entirely. You're putting too much upward force in the movement, Hermione observed, watching critically. The figure 8 should be horizontal, not vertical. Thanks, Hermione, Harry said, trying again. This time the pumpkin drifted more horizontally, though it still had an unfortunate tendency to bob like a cork in water. The twins, naturally, had all 3 charms working within minutes and had moved on to experimentation. Fred's pumpkin glowed green instead of orange, while George had somehow made his pulse like a heartbeat. Boys, Molly said warningly, traditional Halloween colors, please. But Mum, Fred protested, green is very Halloween appropriate. Ghosts and ghouls and all that, George added. Orange gold, Molly said firmly. You can experiment with your own pumpkins later. They worked through the morning, the garden gradually filling with floating pumpkins, as each person mastered the charm sequence. It was harder than it looked. Keeping all 3 spells active simultaneously required concentration and a steady flow of magic. More than once, someone's pumpkin would suddenly drop as they lost focus, or shoot upward as they accidentally added too much power to the levitation. Ron struggled particularly with the illumination charm. His first attempt produced a light so dim it was barely visible. His second was so bright it was nearly blinding. Visualize the color, Molly coached. Think of candlelight, of firelight, warm and gentle. Ron closed his eyes, concentrating hard. When he cast the spell this time, his pumpkin glowed a respectable orange, if slightly uneven. There, see? You've got it. Harry finally managed to get his pumpkin behaving properly, floating at a consistent height, drifting naturally, glowing with steady, warm light. The sense of accomplishment was surprisingly satisfying. It was pleasant magic, the kind meant for beauty and celebration, rather than defense or combat. He'd spent so much time learning spells to protect and fight. There was something deeply appealing about magic that existed simply to make things lovely. This is rather wonderful, Hermione said, standing back to admire their work. 8 pumpkins now floated around the garden in a lazy patrol, their glow visible even in the bright morning sunshine. Imagine how they'll look tonight. Wait until dark, Ginny said. That's when they're really spectacular. Mum usually has them floating all around the property, in the orchard, around the shed, even down by the lane. By mid-morning, they'd successfully enchanted 15 pumpkins, with only 5 more to go. Molly called a break, bringing out cold pumpkin juice and biscuits. They sat on the grass, watching their creations drift peacefully overhead. The trick is maintaining the charms, Molly explained, settling down with her own glass. They'll last about 24 hours on their own, but I usually refresh them each evening during Halloween week. Gives them a bit more staying power. Could you make them permanent? Hermione asked. With a permanent sticking charm variation, perhaps? You could, Molly agreed. But then you'd have glowing pumpkins floating about all year, and that rather defeats the purpose of Halloween decorating. Part of the joy is putting them up and taking them down. Marks the season, doesn't it? Fred and George had finished their pumpkins and were now engaged in what appeared to be a competition to see who could make their pumpkin perform the most elaborate floating pattern. George's was executing loop-de-loops, while Fred's swooped and dived like a very slow, very round snitch. Boys, you're showing off, Molly called. Yes, Mum, they chorused, not stopping at all. Harry worked on his final pumpkin, trying to get the wandering pattern just right. This one kept drifting too far to the right, as though drawn by an invisible magnet. "Here," Ginny said, coming to stand beside him. "You're putting a slight rightward push in your wand movement. Keep it centered." She demonstrated, her own wand tracing a perfect figure 8 in the air. Harry tried to copy her movement, and his pumpkin's drift became more balanced. "Thanks. How'd you learn this so well?" "Practice," Ginny said with a shrug. "I've been helping Mum with the Halloween pumpkins since I was 11. First year, she let me do magic outside school for something besides defending myself from dark wizards." There was something in her tone, not quite bitter, but acknowledging the strangeness of her childhood, learning the Patronus charm at 13, while other witches her age were still mastering basic transfiguration. "Well, you're good at it," Harry said. She smiled, a quick flash of warmth. "Glad my talents are appreciated. Come on, let's get these last ones done before lunch." They finished the remaining pumpkins as the sun climbed toward noon. The garden was now full of floating orange globes, drifting in their gentle patterns, occasionally bumping into each other with soft thumps before drifting apart again. Even unilluminated in the daylight, they looked magical, like something from a Muggle fairy tale, made real. "Perfect," Molly declared, surveying their work with satisfaction. "We'll set the large ones around as centerpieces this afternoon and add some additional decorations. I've got dried cornstalks and some enchanted autumn leaves. But this is the heart of it. Beautiful work, everyone." "My arms are tired," Ron complained, flopping dramatically on the grass. Who knew decorating could be such hard work? "You spent half the morning fighting with one pumpkin," Ginny pointed out. "Yeah, and it fought back." "Did you see how it kept trying to escape? That's because you kept gripping your wand too tightly," Hermione said. "Tension transfers into the spell, making it unstable." "Thank you, Professor Granger," Ron said. But he was grinning. The Floo roared inside the house, and moments later, Arthur appeared in the back doorway, his robes slightly askew and his hair windswept. "How are my favorite decorators?" he called cheerfully. "Oh, excellent. The pumpkins look wonderful." "Was the crisis at work sorted?" "Mostly," Arthur said, coming down to join them. Turned out the alarm clock had developed a rudimentary consciousness and was genuinely trying to wake its owner more effectively. We had to explain the concept of reasonable volume to it. Fascinating interaction between Muggle technology and ambient magic, really. "I've written up a report. I'm sure it's riveting, dear," Molly said affectionately. "Now lunch. Everyone inside and wash up. You're all covered in garden dirt." They trooped inside, leaving the enchanted pumpkins to drift through the garden like lazy orange bees. Harry paused at the door, looking back at their morning's work. The pumpkins bobbed and floated, catching the sunlight, moving with that gentle randomness that made them seem almost alive. Tomorrow night, they'd glow against the darkness, warm lights in the autumn evening, marking the Burrow as a place of magic and welcome. Hermione appeared beside him, following his gaze. "It's lovely, isn't it? This kind of magic, creating beauty just for the sake of it." "Yeah," Harry agreed. "It really is." They went inside together, the smell of Molly's cooking already filling the kitchen, the sound of the Weasley family's laughter drifting through the comfortable chaos of the Burrow. Outside, the pumpkins continued their peaceful drift, patient guardians waiting for nightfall to truly shine. After lunch, Fred and George cornered Harry in the sitting room with matching expressions of barely contained mischief. "Right then, Harry," Fred began, glancing toward the kitchen, where Molly was still tidying up. Time for the important work. George continued. The scientific work, Fred added solemnly. Quality testing, they said together. Harry grinned. What exactly am I testing? Our new line of Halloween merchandise, Fred explained, producing a purple velvet bag from inside his robes. We've been developing these for weeks, but we need an objective tester. Someone who isn't us, George clarified. Someone who'll give honest feedback. And someone Mum won't immediately suspect of being an accomplice. Too late for that, Hermione said, appearing in the doorway with her arms crossed. She'd changed that particular expression to perfection over the years, the one that said she knew they were up to something, but wasn't entirely opposed to it. What are you planning? Nothing dangerous, Fred assured her. Completely harmless, George agreed. Mostly harmless, they amended together. I'm supervising, Hermione declared, settling into one of the armchairs. Proceed. The twins exchanged glances, some silent twin communication passing between them, then shrugged in unison. They'd learned years ago that Hermione would find out anyway, and having her involved meant she couldn't report them to Molly. Well, probably couldn't. Fred upended the velvet bag onto the coffee table. An assortment of colourful sweets, small spheres, and other objects tumbled out, along with several rolls of parchment covered in notes and diagrams. Right, George said, organising the items with surprising efficiency. We've got 3 main product lines for Halloween. First up, Phantom Fudge. He held up a small wrapped sweet that shimmered with an opalescent sheen. Eat one of these, and you become temporarily transparent. Not invisible. You can still be seen, but you're see-through, like a ghost, but you retain full physical presence. How long does it last? Hermione asked immediately. 15 minutes, Fred said. We tested extensively. Any longer and people start to panic. Any shorter and it's not worth the galleons. And it's completely safe? Harry asked. Completely, the twins chorused. We tested it on ourselves, George added. Multiple times, Fred confirmed. Lee tested it, George continued. Angelina tested it, Fred said. Even Verity at the shop gave it a go, George finished. No side effects beyond the transparency. Though Fred did run into a door once when he couldn't see his own feet. That was one time, Fred protested. And in my defense, I was trying to sneak up on George. Did it work? Harry asked. Brilliantly, right up until the door. Harry unwrapped the fudge and examined it. It looked ordinary enough, smelling of chocolate and something faintly minty. What's the worst that could happen? You turn transparent for 15 minutes, Hermione said dryly. I suppose that's not too terrible, though you should test it before tomorrow, when there are more people around. Harry popped the fudge into his mouth. It melted on his tongue, the chocolate flavour giving way to peppermint and something else. Something that tingled strangely. The sensation spread from his mouth through his entire body, a peculiar feeling like being turned inside out very gently. Oh, Hermione gasped. Harry looked down. His hands were fading, becoming translucent. He could see through them to the carpet beneath, could see the outline of his bones like a very faint X-ray. The sensation was deeply odd. He was still solid, could still feel the chair beneath him, but visually, he was becoming ghost-like. How do you feel? George asked, making notes on a piece of parchment. Strange, Harry admitted. His voice sounded normal at least. Not bad, just strange. I can see through my own chest. Brilliant, isn't it? Fred said enthusiastically. We based it on Peruvian instant darkness powder, but inverted the principle. Instead of blocking light, the fudge temporarily allows light to pass through organic matter. The key was calibrating it so it doesn't affect your clothes, George added. Early versions left people's robes floating around empty. Very disconcerting. Ron appeared in the doorway, stopping short. Bloody hell, Harry, you're transparent. Yes, Hermione said. They're testing Halloween products. Can I try? Ron asked immediately. Later, Fred promised. We need to observe Harry's full cycle first. Proper scientific method. Harry stood up, walking around the room. It was profoundly weird to look down and see the floor through his own legs. He picked up a book from the side table. His hands looked like ghostly gloves handling a solid object. This is going to terrify someone, he said. That's rather the point, George said cheerfully. Halloween merchandise, supposed to be spooky. Could you use this for pranks beyond Halloween? Hermione asked suspiciously. Theoretically, Fred admitted. But we're marketing it as a Halloween novelty, George added quickly. Seasonal items only. Besides, Fred continued, 15 minutes isn't long enough for serious mischief. By the time you've set up a proper prank, you're visible again. They spent the next 15 minutes observing Harry's transparent state, while the twins made detailed notes. Hermione asked questions about the magical theory, which Fred and George answered with surprising competence. For all their joking, they took their product development seriously. It's fascinating, Hermione mused. You'd need to understand transfiguration, charms, and probably some potions theory to create something like this. We've been studying, George said, slightly defensively. Properly studying, Fred added. Can't run a successful business on jokes alone. Well, you can, but it's better if the jokes are backed by solid magical theory. Harry gradually became opaque again, the transparency fading from his extremities inward until he looked completely normal. The tingling sensation faded last, leaving only a slight minty aftertaste. How do you feel? George asked, quill poised. Fine. Completely normal. Harry checked his hands, flexing his fingers. No side effects that I can tell. Excellent. Fred made a triumphant mark on his parchment. Phantom fudge passes human trials. Again. What's next? Ron asked eagerly. George held up a small vial containing what looked like eye drops. Ghostly gazes. 2 drops in each eye, and they glow in the dark for an hour. Completely harmless. No effect on vision. I'm not putting random drops in my eyes, Hermione said immediately. We tested them, Fred protested. On yourselves, Hermione countered, which, knowing you two, doesn't necessarily mean safe. Mum used them, George said. That gave Hermione pause. Mrs. Weasley tested your products. We told her they were prototype safety goggles for the shop, Fred admitted. She was very helpful, actually. Suggested we add a vanilla scent to make them less medicinal. I'll try them, Ron volunteered. Later, George said. After dark, so we can see the effect properly. Right now, he held up a small rubber ball that pulsed with a faint purple light. Specttopheres, our personal favorite. Fred took the sphere, tossing it lightly in his hand. You throw one of these, and it creates a temporary phantom. The phantom tells jokes, terrible jokes, for about 5 minutes, then vanishes. Terrible jokes, Harry asked. Magnificently terrible, George confirmed. We programmed in about 50 different jokes, all appropriately ghostly and awful. Perfect for parties. May I? Hermione asked, reaching for the sphere. Fred handed it over carefully. Just toss it anywhere. It'll manifest about 2 feet above where it lands. Hermione examined the sphere with interest, turning it over in her hands. The purple light pulsed steadily, and there were tiny runes etched into its surface. This is sophisticated charm work. You've essentially created a temporary semi-sentient construct. We prefer to call it a joke-telling ghost ball, Fred said. But yes, George admitted, it took us 3 months to develop. The hard part was making the jokes sound natural instead of rehearsed. Hermione stood and tossed the sphere gently toward the center of the room. It bounced once on the carpet, and purple smoke began pouring from it. The smoke coalesced into a vaguely humanoid shape, translucent, wavering, with 2 glowing eyes and a wide, grinning mouth. "Good evening," the phantom said in a hollow, echoing voice. "Why don't ghosts like rain?" A pause, perfectly timed. It dampens their spirits. Ron groaned. Harry couldn't help but laugh. "What's a ghost's favorite dessert?" the phantom continued, floating in a slow circle. "Scream, get it? Ice cream, but scary. These are terrible," Hermione said, but she was smiling. "That's the point," George said delightedly. "They're supposed to be terrible." The phantom continued its routine, delivering one awful pun after another. "Why are graveyards so noisy?" "Because of all the coffin." "What do you call a ghost's true love?" "Their ghoul friend." "Why did the ghost go to the party?" "For the booze." By the time the phantom finished its routine and dissolved back into purple smoke, they were all laughing despite themselves. Even Hermione looked entertained, though she tried to hide it. "Those are genuinely awful," Ron said, wiping his eyes. "Perfect for Halloween," Fred said smugly. "People will love them," George agreed. They spent the next hour going through the rest of the twins' inventory. There were howling hats that emitted spooky sounds when worn, creeping cobwebs that spread slowly across surfaces before dissolving, and midnight mints that temporarily turned your tongue black. "We've got ethical guidelines," Fred explained when Hermione questioned the safety of yet another product. "Nothing that causes actual harm, nothing that lasts more than a few hours, and nothing that can't be reversed with a simple finite. And nothing that would work on muggles," George added. "We don't want our products causing international statute problems." "You've actually thought this through," Hermione said, sounding surprised. "We're not complete idiots," Fred said. "Just partial idiots," George clarified. "Specialized idiots," Fred agreed. The back door opened, and Molly's voice called out, "Boys, I need help bringing in the cornstalks." The twins quickly gathered their merchandise, tucking everything back into the velvet bag. "Not a word to Mum about the testing," Fred said quickly. "She knows we test products," George said. "But she doesn't need to know we test them on Harry," Fred finished. "I won't say anything," Harry promised. "Neither will I," Hermione added, "provided you let me review your safety protocols properly later." "Deal," the twins said together. They headed outside where Molly had indeed accumulated an impressive pile of dried cornstalks, along with bundles of wheat and several crates of what appeared to be enchanted autumn leaves. "These need to be arranged around the garden," Molly explained. "The leaves will charm to swirl gently, just a simple animation charm. The cornstalks go by the gate, the porch, and near the tool shed." It was pleasant work in the afternoon sunshine. Harry and Ron hauled cornstalks, while Ginny and Hermione worked on charming the leaves. Fred and George, under Molly's supervision, set about creating additional decorations, paper bats with actual flapping wings, smiling jack-o'-lanterns' faces that floated without pumpkins attached. Arthur returned from another quick trip to the ministry. Apparently, the sentient alarm clock had developed opinions about snooze buttons and immediately involved himself in the decorating with enthusiastic incompetence. His attempts to arrange cornstalks artistically resulted in something that looked more like a defensive barricade. "Very nice, dear," Molly said diplomatically. "Keeps the garden gnomes out," Arthur said proudly. "It's certainly secure," Hermione offered. By late afternoon, the Burrow's garden had been transformed. The enchanted pumpkins still floated lazily overhead, now joined by swirling autumn leaves that danced in patterns that defied the actual wind. Cornstalks framed the gate and doorway, tied with orange and black ribbon. The twins' paper bats swooped and circled, never straying far from the eaves. Jack-o'-lantern faces grinned from fence posts. "It's perfect," Ginny declared, standing back to admire their work. "Wait until dark," Molly said with satisfaction. "That's when it all comes together. The pumpkins will glow, and I've got some fairy lights to add sparkle. It'll be magical." "It's already magical, Mum," Ron said. "Literally." "You know what I mean," Molly said, swatting him with a dish towel she'd conjured from somewhere. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that matched their decorations perfectly. Harry felt that same contentment from the night before, that sense of being exactly where he should be. Tomorrow would be Halloween itself, with Bill and Fleur arriving, Arthur's muggle stories, and whatever the twins had planned for the evening. But today had been perfect in its own way. Learning new magic, testing ridiculous products, working together to create something beautiful. "Come on," Molly called from the door. "Supper's ready, and after that, Arthur's got a preview of his Halloween stories." They headed inside, leaving the garden to its enchantments. The decorations would keep watch through the evening, the pumpkins beginning to glow as twilight deepened, the paper bats settling into silent roosts, the leaves continuing their gentle dance. Tomorrow would be the celebration, but today had been the preparation. And in the Weasley household, that was just as important, just as full of magic and love, and the kind of warmth that made a house feel like home. After supper, as the last traces of daylight faded beyond the windows and the enchanted pumpkins began their proper glowing in the garden, Arthur Weasley cleared his throat importantly and produced a stack of carefully organized notes from his robes. "Right then," he announced, adjusting his glasses with the air of a university professor about to deliver a crucial lecture. "I've been researching Muggle Halloween traditions for weeks now, and I've discovered some absolutely fascinating and frankly terrifying stories about their inventions." Molly settled into her armchair with her knitting, a fond smile playing at her lips. The twins exchanged glances that promised they'd be on their best behavior, mostly. Ginny curled up on the sofa between Harry and Hermione, while Ron sprawled in the other armchair, looking comfortable and expectant. The fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, through the window, the floating pumpkins drifted past like lazy orange sentinels, their glow warm against the deepening twilight. "Now," Arthur began, consulting his notes with great seriousness, "what I'm about to tell you is all true. I've verified these accounts through multiple Muggle sources, newspapers, magazines, even something called the internet, though I'm still not entirely sure what that is. Dad, Ginny said gently, we know what the internet is. Do you really? Arthur looked at her with such genuine interest that she blushed. How does it work then? Where do they keep all the information? Is there a building somewhere absolutely stuffed with papers? Not exactly, Hermione started. We'll explain later, dear, Molly interrupted smoothly. Let Arthur tell his stories. Arthur looked slightly disappointed to have his question deflected, but rallied quickly. Right, yes, the stories. Let me begin with perhaps the most terrifying of all Muggle inventions. He paused dramatically. The toaster. Fred made a strangled noise that might have been a suppressed laugh. George elbowed him sharply. I know what you're thinking, Arthur said, completely misinterpreting their reactions. It sounds harmless, innocent even. But consider, Muggles place bread, innocent bread, into this device. They push down a lever, trapping the bread inside. Then, his voice dropped to a whisper. Fire, internal fire that the Muggles cannot even see, trapped inside metal walls, heating to dangerous temperatures. That's rather the point, Hermione said carefully. It toasts the bread. But at what cost? Arthur demanded. The bread is subjected to extreme heat, with no means of escape. And then, without warning, he clapped his hands together sharply, making Molly jump. It springs up, violently. I've seen the bread fly several inches into the air. What if a Muggle is leaning over it at the time? They could be struck in the face by projectile toast. Has that ever actually happened? Ron asked, trying very hard to keep a straight face. It must have, Arthur said with absolute certainty. Why else would they design it to be so aggressive? There must be dozens of Muggles injured by flying toast every year, possibly hundreds. The Muggle news services probably cover it up to prevent panic. Harry pressed his lips together, not trusting himself to speak. Beside him, Hermione was studying her hands with intense concentration. And that's not even the worst part, Arthur continued, warming to his subject. The toaster has no intelligence, no ability to judge. It simply heats until a timer, a mechanical device, mind you, with no magical awareness whatsoever, tells it to stop. I've read accounts of Muggles forgetting about their toasters, leaving them unattended. The bread burns. Smoke fills the kitchen. And yet, he paused again, looking around at his audience with wide eyes. The toaster feels nothing. No remorse, no awareness of the destruction it's causing, because it's an appliance. Dad, Ginny said, though she was smiling now. Exactly, Arthur said, triumphantly, as though she'd proven his point. An appliance with the power to create fire and launch food, operated by people with no magical training whatsoever. It's madness. I think we can safely say toasters aren't the existential threat you're imagining, Hermione said gently. Arthur consulted his notes, flipping through several pages. Well, perhaps you'll take the next one more seriously. The vacuum cleaner. Oh, this should be good, Fred whispered. Arthur stood up, as though the gravity of his next tale required he not be sitting. The vacuum cleaner is possibly the most insidious Muggle invention I've encountered. They call it a cleaner, which makes it sound helpful, domestic. But what it actually does is create a vortex, a controlled tornado inside a tube that sucks up everything in its path. That's how it cleans, Ron said. It sucks up dirt. But how does it know what's dirt and what's not? Arthur asked intensely. What if it mistakes something valuable for dirt? What if it consumes something important? I've read that some vacuum cleaners are so powerful they can pick up coins, small toys, even—" He lowered his voice again. "Small pets." "Dad, no," Ginny protested, laughing now. "It's true. I read about a wizard family who lived among muggles. They had a puffskein, lovely creatures, very friendly, and the muggle neighbor's vacuum cleaner nearly consumed it. The poor thing was terrified." "The puffskein or the neighbor?" George asked innocently. "Both, I imagine," Arthur said seriously. The neighbor couldn't understand why her vacuum cleaner was making such strange noises. Fortunately, the wizard retrieved his puffskein before it was fully consumed, but it took weeks for the poor creature to stop cowering every time it heard a humming sound. Molly had given up pretending to knit and was openly smiling now. "Arthur, dear, perhaps the vacuum cleaner wouldn't have been such a threat if the puffskein hadn't been rolling around on the muggle's carpet." "That's victim blaming, Molly," Arthur said with dignity. "The puffskein was simply being a puffskein. It's the vacuum cleaner that chose violence." "Vacuum cleaners don't choose anything," Hermione said, but she was laughing too now. "They're mechanical devices operated by people, are they though?" Arthur leaned forward, conspiratorially. "Because I've also read accounts of vacuum cleaners that turn themselves on without warning. Just start up in the middle of the night, humming and consuming. Some muggles claim their vacuum cleaners seem to deliberately target certain areas, as though the machines have preferences." "That's probably just the way they're programmed," Hermione began. "Programmed?" Arthur seized on the word. "Yes, they admit it. The muggles deliberately give instructions to these devices. They're creating semi-sentient appliances that devour things." "It's not quite the same as—" Hermione tried again. "And don't even get me started on the attachments," Arthur continued, now fully in his element. "They have different heads for different surfaces. Brushes that spin, narrow tubes for reaching into corners. It's like the vacuum cleaner is evolving, developing specialized tools for more efficient consumption." Harry was laughing openly now, unable to help himself. Arthur's complete sincerity combined with his absolute misunderstanding of basic muggle technology was simultaneously hilarious and oddly endearing. "Moving on," Arthur said, consulting his notes again. "Let me tell you about the telephone." "Oh, we know this one's going to be brilliant," Fred said. Arthur ignored him. "The telephone is perhaps the most disturbing muggle invention because of what it does to human voices. Muggles speak into a device, and their voice is somehow captured, trapped inside wires. These wires carry the voice across vast distances, miles and miles, until it emerges from another device in a completely different location." "That's actually fairly accurate," Hermione admitted. "But where does the voice go in between?" Arthur demanded. "It's traveling through wires, but it's not physical, not tangible. Is it ghost-like? Are muggles accidentally creating spectral voices every time they use a telephone?" "It's electrical signals," Hermione explained. "The voice is converted into electricity, transmitted, then converted back into sound." Arthur stared at her. "They turn voices into lightning." "Not exactly lightning. Close enough to lightning that it could kill someone if they weren't careful, though." "Yes," Arthur pressed. "Well, theoretically, electrical shock can be dangerous." "There," Arthur said triumphantly. "So muggles are routinely placing their heads next to devices that contain potentially lethal energy just to have conversations. Why not simply use a flu network? or owls, or enchanted mirrors. Anything that doesn't involve channeling lightning past your ear. Because muggles can't do magic, Dad, Ron said patiently. That's rather the point of being a muggle. Yes, but surely they could learn, Arthur said earnestly. Has anyone tried teaching them? Really tried? I'm sure if we explained it properly. That's not how it works, Molly interjected. Arthur dear, you know perfectly well that muggles don't have magical ability. Seems terribly inefficient, Arthur muttered. Forcing them to rely on dangerous electrical devices and tornado tubes. He flipped through his notes again, and his expression brightened. Oh, this one's particularly good. The microwave oven. Here we go, Ginny whispered to Harry. Now, I'll admit I don't fully understand this one, Arthur began. But from what I've gathered, muggles have invented a box. Just a box, mind you, that cooks food using invisible waves. Microwaves, Hermione supplied. Yes, exactly. Waves that you cannot see, cannot feel, but that heat food from the inside out. Doesn't that strike you as sinister? External heat, like a normal fire, that makes sense. You can see it, understand it, control it. But invisible internal waves? He shook his head. What's to stop those waves from affecting other things? What if you accidentally stood too close? Would you be cooked from the inside out? The microwave has shielding, Hermione said. It's perfectly safe. So they claim, Arthur said darkly. But I've read that you're not supposed to put metal inside a microwave. Why? What happens? Does it explode? Does the metal become possessed by the waves? It creates sparks, Hermione explained. The electromagnetic waves interact with the metal and... Sparks, Arthur interrupted. Spontaneous sparks inside a box in your kitchen. And muggles think this is normal. They just accept that certain materials might cause their food heating box to have an electrical fit. Fred and George were leaning on each other, shaking with suppressed laughter. Ron had his head in his hands. Even Molly was chuckling openly now. And another thing, Arthur continued, really getting into stride now. I've read that you have to cover food in the microwave, or it might explode. Explode? Can you imagine? You put a potato in to heat it, and suddenly, boom, potato shrapnel everywhere. What kind of cooking method includes explosions as a regular possibility? It's not explosions exactly, Hermione tried to explain. It's just that the moisture inside, moisture that violently expands until the food ruptures, Arthur said. That's an explosion, Hermione. That's exactly what an explosion is. He's got you there, Ron said, grinning. Arthur consulted his notes one final time. I've saved the most horrifying for last, he announced. The automobile. Oh, Dad loves cars, Ginny told Harry quietly. This should be interesting. The automobile is a fascinating device, Arthur began, his tone shifting to one of reluctant admiration. A metal box on wheels that moves without any visible means of propulsion. No horses, no magic, just... He gestured vaguely. Internal combustion. Which is? George prompted. Explosions, Arthur said with grim satisfaction. Controlled explosions. Hundreds of them per minute, all contained inside the metal box, driving it forward. Muggles sit inside this box, while explosions happen mere feet from them, propelling them at speeds of 60, 70, sometimes over 100 miles per hour. He stood up and began pacing, his excitement growing. And the roads are filled with these explosive boxes, hundreds of them, all traveling at high speeds, operated by muggles with varying levels of skill and attention. I've seen them. I've been inside them. And let me tell you, it's absolutely terrifying. But you love cars, Ron pointed out. I do, Arthur agreed. They're brilliant. Absolutely brilliant pieces of engineering, but also completely insane. Muggles have normalized the idea of sitting in boxes powered by controlled explosions while hurling down roads at deadly speeds, trusting that all the other explosion boxes will stay in their designated lanes. He paused, looking around at his family with genuine wonder. And most of the time, it works. They've created complex rules, traffic laws, and signals and signs, and somehow, despite having no magical enforcement whatsoever, Muggles mostly follow these rules. It's extraordinary. Terrifying, but extraordinary. I think that might be the most reasonable thing you've said all evening, Hermione observed. Arthur beamed at her. Thank you, Hermione. I do try to be fair to Muggle ingenuity, even when their inventions are clearly trying to kill them. I don't think the inventions are trying to kill anyone, Hermione said, diplomatically. Perhaps not consciously, Arthur conceded, but the capacity for harm is built right in. Toasters that launch bread, vacuum cleaners that consume everything, telephones full of lightning, microwave ovens that make food explode, and automobiles powered by internal combustions. It's a wonder Muggles survive at all, really. And yet, there are billions of them, Molly pointed out, which just proves how resilient they are, Arthur said enthusiastically, surviving despite living in houses full of devices that could malfunction at any moment. It's quite admirable, really. The fire crackled, and outside the window, an enchanted pumpkin drifted past, its warm glow a gentle counterpoint to Arthur's tales of Muggle technological horror. Well, Molly said, setting down her knitting, I think that's quite enough terrifying tales for one evening. Arthur, that was very educational. I've got more, Arthur said, hopefully, holding up his notes. I haven't even told them about the washing machine yet, or the electric kettle, or tomorrow, dear, Molly said firmly. It's getting late, and we've got Bill and Fleur arriving in the afternoon. Everyone needs proper rest. They began gathering up teacups and tidying the sitting room. Harry helped carry things to the kitchen, still smiling at Arthur's earnest descriptions of homicidal household appliances. Your dad's brilliant, he told Ron quietly. He's mental, Ron replied, but there was deep affection in his voice. But yeah, he is pretty brilliant, even when he's completely wrong about everything. Outside, the Halloween decorations continued their enchanted vigil. The pumpkins glowed warmly. The paper bats roosted on the eaves. The autumn leaves danced their endless waltz. Tomorrow would be Halloween proper, with more family arriving, and whatever chaos the twins had planned. But tonight had been perfect in its own way. Arthur's sincere bewilderment at Muggle technology, the family gathered in the warm sitting room, laughter and love, and the comfortable safety of the Burrow wrapping around them all like a favorite blanket. As Harry headed upstairs to bed, he could hear Arthur in the kitchen, still explaining to Molly about the potential dangers of electric kettles. Some things, he thought with a smile, never changed, and thank magic for that. Halloween arrived with a crisp autumn morning, the sky a brilliant blue scattered with wisps of cloud. Harry woke to the smell of something cinnamon-sweet baking and the sound of voices already bustling downstairs. The Burrow was alive with energy, that particular anticipation that came with a holiday fully embraced. By the time he and Ron made it down to breakfast, Molly had already been cooking for what must have been hours. The kitchen table groaned under platters of food, not just breakfast, but preparations for the evening feast. Cauldron cakes cooled on racks, their surfaces shimmering with edible enchantments. A large pumpkin pie sat under a preservation charm, its crust golden and perfect. Strange jellies and Halloween colors wobbled in glass bowls, shifting from orange to purple to black in mesmerizing patterns. "Good morning, dears," Molly said, barely looking up from where she was stirring something that sparked occasionally. "Help yourselves to breakfast. The bacon's still warm. Bill and Fleur's flu is scheduled for 2 o'clock, so we've got time to finish the last decorations." "What's left to decorate?" Ron asked through a mouthful of toast. "We did everything yesterday." "The finishing touches," Molly said, as though this were obvious. "The fairy lights need stringing. I want to add some enchanted cobwebs to the porch railings, and someone needs to check that all the pumpkins are still holding their charms properly." Hermione appeared, already dressed and looking remarkably alert for someone on holiday. "I can check the charm stability on the pumpkins," she offered. "I've been reading about sustained enchantment degradation, and I'd like to see how well they've held up overnight." "Of course you have," Ron muttered affectionately. The morning passed in pleasant activity. Harry and Ron strung fairy lights, actual tiny fairies that Molly had somehow convinced to pose along strings of ivy, their wings creating sparkles of light that would be spectacular after dark. Ginny worked on the enchanted cobwebs, which had to be charmed carefully to spread but not too far, and to look authentically dusty without actually collecting dust. Arthur had taken the day off from the ministry and was in the garden, making final adjustments to the pumpkin formation. He decided they needed to float in more strategic patterns, though what strategy floating pumpkins required, no one was quite sure. "For optimal viewing from all angles," he explained when Ginny asked. "It's very scientific." "It's very something," she replied, but she was smiling. Fred and George had been suspiciously quiet all morning, holed up in their room with the door firmly shut. Occasional muffled bangs and flashes of colored light from under the door suggested they were putting final touches on whatever they had planned for the evening. At precisely 2 o'clock, the flu roared green, and Bill stepped through, tall and confident, his dragon hide jacket dusty from travel. He was followed immediately by Fleur, who emerged looking impossibly elegant despite having just traveled by Flu Network. "Bill!" "Fleur." Molly abandoned her cooking to embrace them both. "Oh, it's so good to see you." "Hello, Molly," Fleur said warmly, returning the embrace. Her accent was still noticeable, but had softened considerably since she'd married into the Weasley family. "See, house looks beautiful, very festive." "All hands on deck for this one," Bill said, grinning around at everyone. "Harry, Hermione, good to see you both. Ron, you've grown again, haven't you?" "Probably," Ron said, self-consciously. He had been eating rather a lot lately. The arrival of Bill and Fleur seemed to signal the start of the real festivities. Molly declared lunch would be light, just sandwiches and soup, to save room for the evening feast. They ate in the garden, surrounded by the floating pumpkins and autumn decorations. The October sunshine warmed despite the season. "The decorations are magnifique," Fleur said, watching an enchanted leaf spiral past. "At Beaubaton, we had Halloween celebrations, but they were very formal." Ziz is much more... She searched for the word. Cozy. That's the Weasley way, Bill said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. Nothing fancy, but lots of heart. After lunch, final preparations began in earnest. Molly directed operations like a general commanding troops, sending people in different directions with specific tasks. The kitchen became a hub of controlled chaos as the evening feast took its final form. Harry found himself assigned to help Hermione check and refresh the pumpkin enchantments. They worked their way around the garden with their wands, Hermione performing diagnostic charms, while Harry reinforced any that were fading. "This one's weakening," Hermione said, pointing to a pumpkin that was hovering slightly lower than the others. The levitation charms degraded about 15% overnight. Not bad, actually. Mrs. Weasley's original casting was very strong. Harry focused and recast the charm, feeling the familiar pull of magic as the pumpkin rose back to its proper height. There was something meditative about the work, the repetitive spell casting, and the quiet satisfaction of making things right. "Can I ask you something?" Hermione said suddenly, moving to the next pumpkin. "Course." She was quiet for a moment, checking the integrity of the wandering charm. "Are you okay? With Halloween, I mean. I know it's not an easy day for you." Harry looked at the pumpkin he was working on, watching its gentle glow. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I mean, it's strange. Halloween's always been complicated. My parents, but also Hogwarts, the troll in first year, the chamber in second year. Seems like something always happens on Halloween. But not this year," Hermione said softly. "No, this year is just nice. Being here with everyone, making it about something other than..." He paused, then shrugged. "This is better. This is what it should be." Hermione smiled, that particular warm smile she saved for moments when she understood without needing everything explained. "I think that's what they're trying to do. Give you good Halloween memories." "It's working," Harry admitted. They finished the pumpkin inspection and headed back inside, where the kitchen had transformed into something from a storybook. The feast was taking shape on every available surface. A massive roast turkey that Molly was basting with something that smelled of herbs and butter. Bowls of roasted vegetables that had been charmed to stay warm. The cauldron cakes they'd seen that morning now, frosted with orange icing that moved in slow swirls. "Those are brilliant," Ron said, eyeing the cakes hungrily. "They're for after dinner," Molly said, without turning around. "Don't even think about it, Ronald." "Wasn't thinking anything," Ron protested. "I have eyes in the back of my head," Molly informed him. "Comes from raising 7 children." The twins thundered downstairs, looking pleased with themselves. They'd changed into matching orange jumpers, clearly Molly's handiwork, and had identical mischievous grins. "Everything ready?" Fred asked cryptically. "Everything's perfect," George confirmed. "What are you two planning?" Bill asked, his curse-breaker instincts immediately suspicious. "Planning? Us?" Fred looked innocent. "We're wounded that you'd suggest," George began. "They're planning something," Ginny interrupted. "They've been weird all day." "We're always weird," the twins said together. As the afternoon faded toward evening, they all gathered in the sitting room, while Molly put the finishing touches on dinner. Arthur had insisted on lighting the fire, the Muggle way, with matches, which took considerably longer than magic, but seemed to give him immense satisfaction. There's something honest about Muggle fire starting, he explained, watching the flames catch. You earn the warmth. Or you could just use magic and have instant warmth, Ron pointed out. Where's the achievement in that? Arthur asked, genuinely puzzled. Darkness fell properly, and the garden transformed. Through the windows, they could see the floating pumpkins glowing like small suns, casting pools of orange light that moved slowly across the grass. The fairy lights along the ivy sparkled, the tiny fairies giggling and whispering to each other. The paper bats had woken with the darkness and were swooping in lazy patterns, their enchanted wings silent. It's beautiful, Fleur breathed, standing at the window. Like a fairy tale. Wait until you see dinner, Ginny said with a grin. Molly called them to the table, and they assembled in the kitchen, squeezing around the table that had been magically extended to accommodate everyone. The feast was spectacular. The turkey golden and steaming, surrounded by dishes that represented both wizarding tradition and Molly's own innovations. There were roasted potatoes that had been charmed to be crispy on all sides simultaneously, carrots glazed with something that sparkled Brussels sprouts that actually looked appetizing, and a basket of rolls that replenished themselves. But it was the Halloween-specific dishes that drew the most attention. The cauldron cakes sat in the center, their frosting still swirling. The color-changing jellies wobbled enticingly, shifting through their spectrum of Halloween hues. There were spark-producing crackers that fizzed harmlessly when you bit into them, giving off tiny fireworks of flavor. A soup tureen contained something Molly called witch's brew, a thick green soup that tasted surprisingly of pea and mint. This is amazing, Mrs. Weasley, Harry said, and meant it completely. Molly dear, she corrected automatically, but looked pleased. I do enjoy cooking for appreciative audiences. They ate and talked, the conversation flowing as easily as the pumpkin juice Molly kept pouring. Bill told stories about curse breaking in Egypt, making Fleur laugh, and Molly look worried. Ginny described the latest Quidditch tactics she'd been practicing. Arthur launched into another explanation about Muggle technology, this time washing machines, until Molly gently redirected him. Hermione asked Fleur about Beauxbatons traditions, and Fleur described elaborate Halloween balls with ice sculptures and coordinated wand lighting displays. But this, she said, gesturing around the cozy kitchen, this is better, more real. As dinner wound down and they began clearing plates, Fred and George exchanged one of their meaningful looks. Now? Fred asked. Definitely now, George confirmed. What? Molly began, but she was too late. Both twins pulled out their wands and cast simultaneously. Purple light shot from both wand tips, spreading through the kitchen like glittering smoke. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the portrait of Aunt Muriel that hung in the corner cleared her throat and began speaking in an exaggerated, spooky voice. Beware. For on this Halloween night, strange things are afoot. Another portrait, a stern-looking wizard they'd never identified, continued the story. In the dungeons deep and caverns old, where shadows dance and stories are told. What did you do? Molly demanded, though she was smiling. Enchanted all the portraits to tell a collaborative ghost story, Fred explained proudly. Took us 3 weeks to coordinate the spell work, George added. Throughout the house, portraits were now speaking in sequence, building a ridiculous ghost story full of dramatic pauses and terrible puns. The story involved a haunted cauldron, a vampire who was afraid of the dark, and a werewolf with a pollen allergy. It gets better, Fred promised. As if on cue, sheets throughout the house began animating, not dangerously, but playfully, floating like cartoon ghosts and making soft woo sounds. One drifted into the kitchen and made a beeline for Ron, who yelped and swatted at it. "They're harmless," George assured everyone, as more sheets drifted in, floating around the room like friendly spirits. Green sparks began appearing randomly, harmless, just decorative, but creating an eerie ambience. They popped into existence with tiny sounds like champagne corks, drifted for a moment, then faded away. "Boys," Molly said, but she was laughing now. "How long does this last?" "About half an hour," Fred said. "Give or take," George added. "And it's all safe?" Bill asked, his curse breaker training making him check the magical signatures. "Completely," the twins chorused. "We tested everything extensively." "On Harry," Hermione added. "Well, yes," Fred admitted, "but he survived fine." The enchanted chaos continued, portraits telling their collaborative story with increasing drama, sheets floating and swooping harmlessly, green sparks popping into existence. Someone discovered that the cauldron cakes now made quiet cackling sounds when you got near them. The color-changing jellies had started wobbling in time to music no one could hear. They moved back to the sitting room, bringing the desserts with them, and settled in to enjoy the twins' handiwork. It was silly and harmless and absolutely perfect. Even the enchanted sheets seemed to be enjoying themselves, floating in lazy patterns around the ceiling. Arthur pulled out his wireless and found a station playing eerie music, the Weird Sisters doing Halloween covers. Molly vanished into the kitchen and returned with mugs of hot chocolate that had been charmed to stay at the perfect temperature. Harry sat on the sofa between Hermione and Ginny, watching an enchanted sheet perform what might have been a waltz with a floating autumn leaf. The portraits had reached the climax of their story. The vampire had discovered that garlic bread was delicious, actually, and the werewolf had found magical antihistamines. The green sparks continued their random appearances, and the cauldron cakes cackled away on the coffee table. Outside, through the window, the pumpkins glowed steadily, the fairy lights sparkled, and the paper bats swooped and circled. The burrow was fully alive with Halloween magic, not dark or scary, but warm and joyful and full of life. "This is perfect," Harry said quietly, and no one disagreed. As midnight approached and the twins' enchantments began to fade, the portraits falling silent, the sheets drifting gently back to their closets, the green sparks appearing less frequently, the Weasley family and their adopted members sat together in the warm sitting room, surrounded by the gentle chaos that was the Burrow at its best. Halloween at the Burrow wasn't about scares or darkness. It was about family, about love, about taking a day that had once meant tragedy and filling it so full of warmth and laughter that there was no room left for shadows. And for Harry, sitting there with hot chocolate in his hands and the sound of the Weasleys' laughter around him, it was exactly what he needed. A new Halloween memory, bright and warm enough to outshine all the dark ones. Outside, the enchanted pumpkins kept their watch, glowing orange against the October night, patient guardians of a home where magic meant safety, belonging, and love. The clock in the sitting room chimed 11, its soft bells barely audible over the Weird Sisters crooning from the wireless. The twins' initial enchantments had faded, leaving behind only the occasional stray green spark and one determined sheet that seemed reluctant to return to the linen cupboard. "Bedtime, I think," Molly announced, though no one moved to get up. There was something about the evening that made the idea of ending it feel wrong, as though going to bed would break the spell that had settled over the Burrow. "Just a bit longer, Mum," Ginny asked. "It's not even midnight yet." Molly looked around at her family. Bill and Fleur curled together in one armchair, the twins sprawling on the floor. Ron half asleep with his head tipped back. Ginny, Harry, and Hermione crowded on the sofa. Arthur had dozed off in his favorite chair, his glasses askew, his notes about muggle dishwashers still clutched in one hand. "All right," she conceded. "Until midnight. But then it's bed for all of you. We'll have clearing up to do tomorrow." Fred and George exchanged one of their looks, the kind that meant they were communicating in their mysterious twin language. George glanced at his watch. Fred nodded almost imperceptibly. "Actually," Fred said, stretching with elaborate casualness, "George and I need to check on something upstairs." "Just for a minute," George added. "What are you checking on?" Hermione asked suspiciously. "Shop inventory," they said together, already heading toward the stairs. "At 11 o'clock at night," Hermione called after them. "Best time for inventory," Fred's voice echoed down. Very quiet, minimal distractions. Hermione looked at Harry and Ron. "They're planning something else." "Obviously," Ron said, not bothering to open his eyes. "Question is, what?" They didn't have to wait long to find out. 10 minutes later, as the clock's hands crept toward 11:15, both twins reappeared at the top of the stairs. They'd changed into matching black robes, clearly saved for this moment, and both held their wands ready. "Ladies and gentlemen," Fred announced, in his best showman's voice, "witches and wizards," George continued, "we present the Midnight Mischief Spectacular." They cast together a complex spell that involved synchronized wand movements Harry had never seen before. Golden light poured from both wands, spreading through the burrow like liquid sunshine, seeping into walls, pooling in corners, disappearing into the very fabric of the house. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the portrait of Aunt Muriel spoke again, but this time her voice was different, deeper, more theatrical. "Welcome, welcome, to a Halloween tale most strange and spectacular, a story of haunts and humor, of spirits and silliness." "Oh no," Molly said, but she was smiling. "What have you done?" "Enhance the earlier enchantment," Fred said, coming down the stairs with George at his heels. "This is the premium version. Lasts until dawn, or until someone casts the counter charm," George added, "which we've written down and left on the kitchen table." "Probably, definitely," Fred corrected. "We definitely left it on the kitchen table, or possibly the dresser. Somewhere obvious, anyway." The portraits throughout the house began speaking again, but this time they weren't telling a story. They were performing one. The stern wizard's portrait flickered, and suddenly he was wearing an elaborate costume, playing the role of a haunted house's owner. Aunt Muriel had transformed into a dramatic ghost floating across her frame. "Brilliant," Bill said, sitting up properly to watch. "What else does it do?" As if answering him, a soft sound began. Footsteps overhead, creaking floorboards, the gentle groan of old wood settling. But the sounds were rhythmic, almost musical, creating an eerie percussion. "The house is part of the performance," George explained. "We've charmed it to provide sound effects, Completely harmless, Fred assured Molly, who had opened her mouth to ask, just atmospheric. Watch this. He tapped his wand against the wall, and suddenly music swelled from somewhere. Not the wireless, but from the burrow itself, as though the walls had learned to sing. It was haunting, but not frightening. A melody that sounded like autumn nights and magic and mischief. The enchanted sheets returned, but this time there were more of them, at least a dozen, floating from various rooms to join the performance. They'd been charmed to glow softly from within, creating the illusion of proper ghosts, and they moved with more personality now, some dancing, others drifting dramatically, one performing what appeared to be interpretive dance. That one's got a sense of drama, Ginny observed, pointing to a sheet that was swooning through the air with theatrical flair. The green sparks returned too, but now they were accompanied by orange, purple, and silver ones, creating a magical fireworks display that popped and fizzed throughout the room, never quite close enough to startle anyone, but providing constant points of light and color. Look at the windows, Hermione said quietly. Outside, the floating pumpkins had begun moving in patterns, no longer random drifting, but coordinated movement, like a slow ballet. They wove between each other, their lights creating trails of orange against the darkness. The fairy lights along the ivy had brightened, the tiny fairies now clearly visible, giggling and performing their own aerial acrobatics. Did you charm the outside decorations too? Harry asked, impressed despite himself. We enhanced Mum's original charms, Fred said. Added a bit of choreography, time to activate at 11:15. The whole thing builds to midnight, George explained. That's when it gets really good. Arthur had woken up during the commotion and was watching the enchanted sheets with delight. Marvelous. Simply marvelous. The coordination alone must have taken 3 months of planning, Fred confirmed. 2 months of testing, George added. 1 very expensive conversation with an enchantment specialist, they said together. Boys, Molly said, her voice carrying that particular mixture of exasperation and pride that only a mother could achieve. You spent money on this. Shop expenses, Fred said quickly. Research and development, George added. Plus, it's Harry's Halloween gift, Fred continued. Can't put a price on that. Harry felt warmth spread through his chest. Not from magic, but from the simple fact that the twins had put this much effort into making Halloween special for him. For all of them, really. But knowing he was part of the reason made it mean something more. The portrait's performance continued, growing more elaborate. They were acting out a full play now, a comedy about a haunted house whose ghosts were more frightened of the living family than the family was of them. The ghosts kept trying to scare the family, failing spectacularly and running away in terror when the family's children wanted to play with them. That's rather clever, Hermione said, laughing as portrait children chased portrait ghosts across multiple frames. The spellwork to coordinate timing across different portraits is complicated, George finished. Believe us, we know. We had to account for frame size, portrait personality, and the fact that some portraits are more cooperative than others. Aunt Muriel was particularly difficult, Fred said. Though she's giving an excellent performance now, George admitted, gesturing to where Aunt Muriel's portrait was dramatically swooning, playing a ghost who'd fainted at the sight of a rubber spider. The music swelled, and the enchanted sheets began a coordinated dance forming patterns in the air, spirals, waves, and finally spelling out Happy Halloween in glowing letters that hung in the air for a moment before dissolving into a shower of harmless sparks. Show-offs, Ron said, but he was grinning. Fleur had pulled out her wand and was examining the magical signatures with professional interest. "This is very sophisticated," she said. "The layering of the charms, the timing. You've created something quite impressive." "Thank you," the twin said, looking genuinely pleased. The clock chimed the half hour, 11:30 now, and the performance shifted again. The portraits began a countdown of sorts, their play speeding up, building towards some finale. The sheet's dance became more elaborate, swooping and spinning with increased energy. The sparks appeared more frequently, creating almost constant points of light throughout the room. Outside, the pumpkin's ballet had transformed into something more complex. Patterns within patterns, their orange lights creating geometric shapes against the darkness before dissolving and reforming into new configurations. "What happens at midnight?" Bill asked, his curse-breaker instincts both impressed and slightly concerned. "You'll see," Fred said mysteriously. "Nothing dangerous," George assured everyone. "Just spectacular." "Those two things aren't mutually exclusive," Hermione pointed out. "In this case, they are," the twins promised together. Molly had given up any pretense of sending people to bed and had instead conjured more hot chocolate, passing mugs around. They settled in to watch the show, the Burrow's sitting room transformed into a theatre where the walls themselves performed. The music grew more intense, building towards something. The portraits acted faster, their comedy play racing toward its conclusion. The sheets spun in tighter spirals, moving closer together. Even the sparks seemed to pulse in rhythm with the music, creating a light show that reflected off every surface. Harry found himself on the edge of his seat, caught up in the anticipation. Beside him, Ginny was watching the sheets dance with bright eyes, while Hermione was still trying to analyze the spell work, even as she enjoyed the performance. 1 minute, George announced, checking his watch. The countdown was palpable now. The portraits were finishing their play. The ghost family and the human family had become friends, deciding to share the haunted house in harmony. The sheets were forming a circle, spinning slowly, their glow intensifying. The music reached a crescendo. 30 seconds, Fred whispered. Outside, every pumpkin in the garden rose higher, forming a perfect sphere of orange lights hovering above the burrow. The fairy lights blazed brighter, the tiny fairies all calling out in excited squeaks. 10 seconds, both twins said together. The entire family was watching now. Even Arthur had straightened in his chair, his notes forgotten. Molly held her mug of chocolate, smiling despite herself. Bill had his arm around Fleur, both of them looking up at the circling sheets. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The clock began to chime midnight, and everything happened at once. The sheets exploded outward in a burst of harmless light, each one transforming momentarily into a different Halloween image. Jack-o'-lanterns, bats, cats, owls, before reforming into plain sheets and settling gently to the floor like exhausted dancers taking a bow. The portraits all cheered and applauded, their performance complete, the characters in the play joining hands across frames and bowing to their audience. The sparks, all colors now, converged in the center of the room, forming a single brilliant point of light that hung there for a heartbeat before exploding into a shower of colours that rained down like confetti, disappearing before they touched anything. And outside, the sphere of floating pumpkins burst apart in a coordinated explosion of light, each pumpkin shooting off in a different direction before slowly descending back to their original positions, their ballet complete. The music faded, replaced by the sound of actual applause, the portraits clapping, the family clapping, even the awakened paintings throughout the Burrow joining in the appreciation. "Bravo," Arthur called out. "Absolutely brilliant, boys." "That was amazing," Ginny said, her voice full of genuine awe. "C'est coordination," Fleur breathed. "C'est timing. C'est magnifique." Fred and George took elaborate bows, clearly delighted with the response. Thank you, Fred said. "We're here all week," George added. "Actually, just tonight," Fred corrected. "Right, yes, just tonight." But what a night. Hermione had her wand out, casting revealing charms to examine the residual magic. "This is extraordinary," she said. "The complexity of the timing spells alone. How did you synchronize everything across such different magical systems? Portraits, objects, external enchantments. They all operate on different magical frequencies." "Trade secret," the twins said together, tapping their noses. "But if you're genuinely interested," George added, "we could show you our notes. We had to develop a new synchronization charm specifically for this." "I would very much like to see those notes," Hermione said immediately. Ron yawned hugely. "That was brilliant and all, but I'm exhausted. All that suspense takes it out of you." "Midnight has passed," Molly said, though she looked far less stern than she might have an hour ago. "Bed, all of you. And boys." She looked at the twins. "That was truly spectacular. Well done." Fred and George beamed like they were 5 years old, receiving praise for a good report from school. "Thanks, Mum," they said together. The family began dispersing, heading toward bedrooms with murmured goodnights. Bill and Fleur were staying in Bill's old room, the twins in theirs, everyone else in their usual spots. The Burrow settled into quiet, the portraits whispering among themselves about their performance, the enchanted sheets having finally returned to their proper cupboards. Harry paused at the window before heading upstairs. Outside, the pumpkins had returned to their gentle drifting, their glow warm and steady against the darkness. The fairy lights still sparkled, though less intensely now. The paper bats settled into silent roosts along the eaves. "Good Halloween?" Ginny asked, appearing beside him. "The best," Harry said honestly. "Really? This was..." He struggled to find words. "I've never had a Halloween like this. Usually, it's either terrible or just complicated. This was just good." "That's what we were hoping for," Ginny said quietly. "Mum's been planning it for weeks. She wanted you to have good Halloween memories. We all did." "Tell her it worked," Harry said. "Tell everyone it worked." Ginny smiled, the kind of smile that lit up her whole face. "I will. Now come on. Ron's probably already snoring, and you know how loud he gets." They headed upstairs together, the Burrow settling into its nighttime quiet around them. In Ron's room, Ron was indeed already snoring softly, sprawled across his bed, still half-dressed. Harry changed quietly and climbed into his camp bed, pulling the warm blankets up. Through the window, he could see a single pumpkin drift past, its orange glow reflecting on the glass. Somewhere below, he heard Molly's voice murmuring a final goodnight to someone, heard Arthur's quiet reply. The Burrow creaked gently, the old house settling, content. Harry closed his eyes, replaying the evening in his mind. The spectacular midnight performance, the family gathered together, the twins' obvious pride in their creation, the way everyone had worked to make this Halloween special. Not to erase the past or pretend the darkness hadn't happened, but to create something bright enough to stand alongside it. His last thought before sleep claimed him was that Halloween didn't have to mean tragedy. It could mean this: family, magic, warmth, and belonging. The twins had given him that gift, wrapped in enchantments and mischief and spectacular timing. Outside, the enchanted pumpkins continued their watch through the October night, glowing steadily, marking the Burrow as a place where magic meant home, where Halloween meant joy, and where Harry Potter was loved and welcomed and safe. The best Halloween he'd ever had, and he'd remember it always, not because of darkness, but because of light. Harry woke to soft golden sunlight streaming through the window and the distant sound of someone, probably Molly, already moving about downstairs. For a moment, he lay still, watching dust motes dance in the light, feeling the pleasant weight of warm blankets and the contentment that came from a good night's sleep in a safe place. Across the room, Ron was still buried under his covers, only his red hair visible. Harry smiled and levered himself out of bed, stretching. November 1st. Halloween was over, but its warmth lingered like the last notes of a favorite song. The kitchen was quieter than yesterday's organized chaos, but no less welcoming. Molly stood at the stove in her dressing gown, her hair still in nighttime disarray, stirring porridge with one hand while levitating the kettle with the other. She looked tired but happy, the kind of tired that came from a successful celebration. "Good morning, dear," she said, spotting Harry. "You're up early. Sleep well?" "Really well," Harry said, and meant it. "Do you need help with anything?" "Bless you, no. Sit down. Have some tea. The others will be down soon enough, though I expect the twins will sleep until noon after all their excitement last night." Harry poured himself tea and settled at the table. Through the window, he could see the garden in morning light. The enchanted pumpkins were still floating, though their glow was invisible in the sunshine. The fairy lights looked like ordinary ivy in daylight. The paper bats hung motionless from the eaves, their enchantment dormant until darkness returned. "It all looks different in the morning," Harry observed. "Magic often does," Molly agreed, bringing over a bowl of porridge and sitting across from him. "The nighttime enchantments are spectacular, but there's something nice about seeing it all in daylight too. Reminds you it's real, not just a dream." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind of quiet that existed between people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. Outside, a garden gnome scuttled past, still wearing the tiny hat Ginny had made for it. "Thank you," Harry said suddenly, "for all of this. For Halloween. For making it." He paused, searching for the right words. "For making it mean something different." Molly reached across the table and patted his hand, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Oh, Harry, your family. This is what families do. We make new memories together, better ones. You deserve Halloweens full of joy, not sorrow." "I know Halloween will always be complicated for me," Harry continued, needing to say it. "Because of my parents. But this, yesterday, last night, it helps. It gives me something else to think about when Halloween comes around. Something warm." "That's all we wanted," Molly said softly. "Arthur and I talked about it last year. After everything. We thought Harry's been through enough darkness. If we can give him light, we should. So we planned this year to be special. The twins, Harry started. Oh, those two have been working on their midnight spectacular since August, Molly said, half exasperated, half proud. Testing spells, coordinating timing, spending galleons they should have been saving. But they wanted to do something extraordinary for you. For all of you, really, but especially you. Harry felt his throat tighten. I don't know what I did to deserve this family. You survived, Molly said simply. You kept going, kept choosing good even when it would have been easier to choose darkness. You loved people and let them love you back. That's more than enough, Harry. Footsteps on the stairs announced Hermione's arrival. She looked sleep-tousled but alert, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing one of the Weasley jumpers Molly had given her years ago. Morning, she said, stifling a yawn. Is that porridge? Brilliant. I'm starving. How someone your size can eat so much, I'll never understand, Molly said fondly, getting up to serve another bowl. Ginny appeared next, followed shortly by Arthur, who looked far too energetic for someone who'd stayed up until midnight. Bill and Fleur came down together, and finally Ron stumbled in, looking half asleep, drawn by the smell of food. Breakfast was leisurely, everyone moving slowly, still tired from the night before, but content. They ate porridge and toast, drank tea and pumpkin juice, and talked about the previous evening's spectacular. The synchronization was remarkable, Hermione was saying to Fred and George, who had indeed slept until nearly 11 and had just appeared, looking rumpled. I've been thinking about the spell work. You must have used a master charm to coordinate all the subsidiary enchantments. Something like that, George said through a mouthful of toast. We can show you our notes later if you want, Fred offered. Fair warning, though, they're mostly diagrams and calculations. Very boring unless you're into that sort of thing. I am very much into that sort of thing, Hermione said firmly. After breakfast, the real work began, cleaning up and taking down decorations. It was a family effort, everyone pitching in to restore the Burrow to its normal state of organized chaos. Do we have to take down all the pumpkins? Ron asked, watching them float peacefully overhead. They're quite nice. They're Halloween decorations, Ron, Molly said patiently. We can't have floating pumpkins year-round. What would the neighbors think? We don't have neighbors, Ron pointed out. That's not the point, Molly replied, though she was smiling. They worked through the morning, collecting decorations and dispelling enchantments. Some charms were stubborn. One particularly determined sheet kept trying to float away when they attempted to return it to the cupboard, and several of the paper bats had apparently developed attachments to their roost and refused to be banished. This one's got personality, Bill said, trying to coax a bat down from the eaves. Maybe we should keep him as a pet. We are not keeping enchanted paper as pets, Molly said firmly, though she looked amused. The pumpkins were the most work. Each one had to have its enchantments carefully removed. Levitation, wandering pattern, and illumination, all in reverse order. It was delicate work, and Hermione insisted on doing most of them herself, treating it as a learning exercise. If you don't remove them in the right order, the pumpkin might shoot off in a random direction, she explained to Harry, who was helping. The wandering charm has to come off first, then the levitation, then the illumination. Otherwise, the magical fields interfere with each other. What happens if they interfere? Harry asked, carefully dispelling the wandering charm on a particularly plump pumpkin. Nothing dangerous, Hermione assured him. Just chaotic. The pumpkin might spiral or flash different colors or make strange noises. I read about a wizard who tried to remove all 3 charms simultaneously, and his pumpkin started singing opera for 3 hours. That doesn't sound too bad, Harry said, grinning. It was Wagner, Hermione said seriously. Very loud Wagner. His neighbors complained. They worked steadily, the pile of de-enchanted pumpkins growing. Molly had declared that she'd use them for pies and soups over the coming weeks. Waste not, want not, and had already started sorting them by size. Fred and George were in charge of collecting their own specialty items. The Specttopheres and phantom fudge wrappers and various other bits of magical merchandise that had been deployed during the evening. They moved through the house with bags, picking up evidence of their mischief. This one's still active, George said, holding up a sphere that pulsed faintly. Must have missed its activation window. Keep it for testing, Fred suggested. We can use it for the next product demonstration. By early afternoon, the burrow was looking almost normal again. The cornstalks had been bundled and stored in the shed for composting. The enchanted leaves had been released to scatter naturally. The fairy lights were being carefully coaxed back into their containers, the tiny fairies complaining in high-pitched voices about being put away. You'll come out again next year, Molly promised them. Don't fuss so. 1 pumpkin remained. The perfect one Molly had mentioned wanting to keep. It floated near the kitchen window, still glowing softly even in daylight, its enchantments intact. Just this one, Molly said, when Arthur raised an eyebrow. It's such a nice one, and it'll only last a week or so. A little reminder of a lovely Halloween. Of course, dear, Arthur said, because he knew better than to argue when Molly had made up her mind about something. They broke for lunch, leftover turkey and vegetables, which so meow tasted even better the day after. The kitchen table was crowded again, everyone tired from the morning's work, but satisfied. There was something pleasant about the clean-up, about the way they'd all worked together to put things right. Shame it's over, Ron said, helping himself to more turkey. Could do with a few more days of celebration. There's always next year, Ginny pointed out. And Christmas isn't far off, Molly added. We'll have plenty more celebrating to do. After lunch, Bill and Fleur had to leave. Something about Bill's work schedule and appointments Fleur couldn't miss. There were hugs and promises to visit soon, and then they were stepping into the flue in a swirl of green flames. The twins announced they needed to get back to the shop. Can't leave Verity running things alone for too long, and departed with final flourishes and bows, promising to send over their notes about the enchantment synchronization for Hermione. The burrow felt quieter with them gone, but not uncomfortably so. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny settled in the sitting room while Molly and Arthur pottered about, putting final touches on the restoration. That really was brilliant, Ron said, stretching out on the sofa. Best Halloween we've had in years. Best Halloween ever, Harry corrected quietly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the autumn sunlight streaming through the windows, dust motes dancing in the light. The single preserved pumpkin drifted past the window, its glow a gentle reminder of the night before. Do you think they'll top it next year? Ginny asked. The twins, Hermione considered. Probably. They're already planning something, I'd bet. They always are. I hope they do, Harry said. I hope every Halloween from now on is like this. Full of family and magic and things to look forward to instead of things to dread. It will be, Hermione said with certainty. We'll make sure of it. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, they helped with the last bits of cleanup, then settled in for a quiet dinner. Just simple soup and bread, nothing fancy after the previous night's feast. Arthur told one more story about Muggle technology, this time about vacuum cleaners, which he'd been unable to fit into his Halloween tales. And Molly shook her head fondly throughout. That evening, as Harry packed his bag to return to Grimmauld Place the next morning, he paused to look out Ron's window. The garden was dark now, just one pumpkin glowing in the kitchen window, a single point of warm orange light against the November darkness. He thought about his parents, as he always did on Halloween. But this year, the thought wasn't consumed by loss and grief. Instead, he found himself thinking they would have loved this, would have wanted him to have Halloweens full of laughter and warmth, surrounded by people who loved him. The Burrow had given him that. The Weasleys had given him that. You all right? Ron asked, looking up from where he was attempting to stuff dirty socks into his laundry bag. Yeah, Harry said, and meant it completely. Just thinking about how lucky I am. We're the lucky ones, mate, Ron said seriously. Having you here, part of all this. Mum's exact words, by the way. She said it this morning. We're lucky to have Harry as part of our family. Harry felt his eyes sting and blinked hard. I'm lucky to be part of it. That night, lying in the camp bed for the last time this visit, Harry listened to the familiar sounds of the Burrow settling for sleep. Ron's gentle snoring, the ghoul banging about in the attic, the creak of old wood and the whisper of magic that permeated every board and stone of the house. Through the window, he could just see the preserved pumpkins glow from the kitchen, a small beacon of warmth. Tomorrow, he'd return to Grimmauld Place, to his own life and responsibilities, but he'd carry this with him, the memory of floating pumpkins and terrible puns, of enchanted sheets dancing and portraits performing, of a family that had taken a day marked by tragedy and filled it with so much love that the darkness couldn't find room to settle. Halloween at the Burrow had been exactly what he needed. Not an erasure of the past, but a bridge to a better future. A reminder that darkness could be answered with light, that grief could coexist with joy, that the best way to honor those you'd lost was to live fully and love deeply. The Weasleys had given him that gift, wrapped in pumpkin enchantments and midnight mischief, and the simple act of making him feel like he belonged. As sleep claimed him, Harry smiled. Next Halloween, he'd be back, and the year after that, and all the years to come, building more bright memories, adding more light to balance the dark. Because that's what family did. They gave you reasons to celebrate, even on the hardest days. They gave you home, belonging, and the courage to face whatever came next. And Harry Potter, who had started life marked by Halloween tragedy, had finally found what everyone deserved, a Halloween that meant joy. Outside, the preserved pumpkin glowed steadily through the November night, a patient guardian keeping watch over the Burrow, over the family sleeping within, over the boy who had finally found his way home. The enchantment would fade in a week, but the memories, Those would last forever, bright and warm as pumpkin light, strong as magic, enduring as love. Happy Halloween at the Burrow, and all the Halloweens yet to come.